My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. As you can see, I was in the Kruger Park, guys, and I just want to make you very jealous. Mike, I know I spoke to you when I was there, and we were chatting briefly about that video that I sent, and I happen to have it here. I'm going to give it a go and see if I can share the screen, because it was just such a cool moment with that line. Let's see if it works. I'm going to hit share. It does look like it's working. Okay, cool. Let's hit play. So I don't know if you can hear me, but
yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
I had my window rolled down, and I had my phone, as you can see there, just outside the window, and I was trying to see how long I could last without rolling up that window. But my blood sugar levels were dropping at a rate. But you cannot believe how big those animals are. Charles actually does know. He was telling me earlier because of when he was in Africa. But I cannot describe the feeling of
the thing
seeing
that
those
struck
things
me,
so
Jerm,
close.
about it was as they're walking towards you, you don't get a hint of the sheer power. But as they walk past you and you see those rippling muscles, you appreciate just how powerful those animals are.
Now look at this one right next to the car. There, that's when I roll up the window, because I decide no, because
as if that would have stopped it.
No, well, also she's the mother. You can see that she's the one with the milk. So if there was to be any drama, it would be her that would be likely to get cross.
Yeah, and what made that even more daunting is the fact that there was a cub, and you don't really want to mess around with the mother of, well, a lioness with a cub. And as you saw when she walked past the car, her shoulders were above my window level. I mean, that is huge. You can see that's majesticness. Just by the way, for those watching or listening, I'm sitting in a coffee shop. You guys know my fiber line was broken while we were away. Construction workers dug into the ground and they snapped the cable, so I have to use the Wi-Fi at the local coffee shop. But one of the things that I love about living in Africa is, and Charles, you've spent time in Africa, so I'm sure you'll agree to some degree, but there is a sense of freedom in our broken infrastructure, and I quite like that. Did you find a sense of freedom when you were in Kenya?
Very much so, and in plenty of other places as well. I think it's very interesting, especially as it depends whether you are in any of these countries, I would say, any of the sub-Saharan countries, whether you're a citizen, whether you're resident, or whether you're just a visitor. And I think that does definitely make quite a considerable difference on your experience there and your perspective. And I've been lucky enough to travel in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, but also work there in different capacities as well. And yes, I mean, I would absolutely agree, but to a point, and there are differences. And what I would say, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this in South Africa, but certainly in East Africa, what I would say is that whilst there are great big expanses of land and it's very easy to feel like you're off the beaten track, it is actually incredibly hard to find a place where after more than 30 minutes, at least one child with a dog or a goat has not found you. And that, I'm not suggesting that doesn't still give a sense of freedom, but it does mean that you're never quite in the middle of what you think is nowhere. And the reason I say this is because the spaces, lots of Africa are regulated or controlled. The Kruger, obviously, you have to either, well, presumably you actually, even if you're a citizen, you'll still have to pay to get in. You have to be registered, you have to be booked in, and this, that, and the other. Now, of course, you've just showed us a video that demonstrates the sort of thing that you might see when you're in there. But what I would say about the United Kingdom, British Isles, and a lot of Western Europe is that the critical difference is that whilst you might not be in a situation like that with regard to wildlife, you don't have the same process by which you're sort of booking into here, and there's effectively an audit trail of where you are, what you're doing, and indeed that you have to pay for it. So the way that the park system, the wild spaces, let's call them, in the United Kingdom work, the British Isles, so far it's completely unregulated, completely unmonitored. So you can travel exactly where you like, and in the places where there are sort of bothies or lodges or whatever, that's a matter between you and the person that owns it. There's no park authority that you have to deal with, which is not to say these authorities don't exist. They do, but they're there for effectively for the sort of land husbandry and that sort of thing. So there is a difference. And also it is absolutely possible to walk in particularly the north of England or Wales or Scotland for very long periods of time without seeing a single person. And oddly, and I always find this odd because Africa is so big and the spaces in a lot of these countries that we refer to are so big, but it is bizarre to feel like you're on the edge of the earth and then suddenly, and I think you know what I'm talking about, suddenly, usually a little boy or a couple of little boys will just appear. And they won't appear, and again, I'm not having a go at them because I totally understand the natural curiosity, but they won't appear and just carry on doing what they're doing. They will appear and come and talk to you, and they absolutely will not leave you alone. So it's a really interesting difference insofar as evaluating what exactly we mean by freedom. And I don't say that to sort of do down the African freedom or the African experiences, but I do think for context it is quite fascinating that at the moment, and the reason I say at the moment is because this idea of natural capital and everything being turned into a commodity means that the situation as it is probably unlikely to continue forever and ever. It looks set to change. But nonetheless, it is quite a fascinating distinction. Whether if we did have the wildlife, and there's a place up in the north of Scotland called Allerdale, which was a huge estate bought up by a chap who's what's called Lister, Paul Lister, and his plan was to reintroduce a lot of the wildlife that these islands did contain: wolves, bears, lynx, that sort of thing. He's been very much frustrated by the authorities, as you'd imagine. And of course, people say, oh, you know, what about the sheep and this and the other? Now, that's a private place. So therefore, yes, of course, you do have to pay. But so some of what I'm describing with regard to Africa is happening here, but not with regard to what we describe as national parks here. So it is a really interesting sort of contrast, I suppose.
I wasn't really referring to open space necessarily being equivalent to freedom, but I suppose, being more philosophical in the sense that the lack of top-down infrastructure lends itself to a kind of freedom of the mind in a way. Let me give an example. When I went to Europe, now you guys you right there, so for you it's normal, but for me the amount of bureaucracy that was required to enter Europe was unbelievable. Someone said to me this morning that, you know, that in China, you are compelled to obey. I was heavily compelled to obey when I was in Europe. And I don't have that sense where I am, which is one of the reasons why I do enjoy living where I live, but it comes at a cost. And it's that cost benefit ratio that one has to balance. I was chatting to Vanessa actually when I was in Kruger, and she was saying, you know, she lives in one of the most ravaged countries in the world, Lebanon. And she says, yet she feels the safest and probably, you know, the happiest that she could be of all places, which in a weird way underpins what I'm saying.
It's interesting you say that about Europe. I mean, to a certain degree, that's true if you have to engage with population centers. But if we look at France, for example, which has, we've got to acknowledge, one of the worst bureaucracies on the planet, its population is largely gathered into, you know, 4 or 5 major cities, whatever it is. I don't know how many major cities it is, but anyway, the point is in between. It's, you know, relative to England, for example, the population density in the countryside areas is very, very low. And so, you know, when we went to live there for a couple of years when my kids were very young, well, what were they, 3, 4 years old, something around that. And we were there for 2 years, and basically we didn't have to deal with bureaucracy at all. We never saw the police. We just went and played with the wild boar and the wolves sort of thing. You know, what I'm not being quite serious about that, but the point is, we just walked in the mountains and saw nobody, and it was absolutely fantastic. And yes, sometimes we ran up against wild boar, but there was never any concern about that. And the only time that we ever had to worry about sort of personal safety was when the hunters were out once a year for a few weeks, and then you did have to be a little bit careful because you just had to be careful that you weren't going to get shot by accident. But aside from that, there was no engagement with bureaucracy whatsoever, and it actually was extremely free. So you're absolutely able to, if you organize things properly, get away from the bureaucracy that we face in Europe.
But that's actually a good point that you're making, because when I was engaging in the UK column forums, there was a brief discussion about overpopulation. And one of the members was saying, yes, it's his perception that the world is overpopulated. And I don't see that at all, based on what you're saying, for example, where you can go into the middle of a country and there are very few people. If I travel between Cape Town and Johannesburg, it's a 2-hour flight. 98% of the land below me is empty, completely empty. And it's only that concentration in sort of localized areas where you get the perception of overpopulation, and of course, perhaps then excessive bureaucracy.
The key word there was perception, and a lot of it has to do with the state of infrastructure. And at the end of the day, are we able to just live our lives? And when society is feeling overpopulated because the roads are bunged up and you can't get from A to B, or you can't get a seat on a train, or whatever it happens to be, that's when it starts to feel overpopulated. Go to China and see what population density is like, but the infrastructure works. So actually, it doesn't feel, it clearly feels populated, and clearly you're in amongst, hundreds or thousands of people as you're walking through the streets of Beijing or whatever. But it's not that same feeling of disruption and I just can't get on with what it is I want to do. But as you say, in the meantime, while we're all stuck in our cities, there are ways to get away from that. And it's a question of how we organize our lives.
Just bureaucracy. I just think a couple of anecdotes that either support your case or not. I think the particular African country does make a difference. And by two contrasting examples, and not forgetting, of course, given Africa's colonial history, bureaucracy is a legacy, and what's been unfortunate about it is that quite often the situation now will be in effect a sort of an upgraded version of the colonial bureaucracy. Because anyway, never mind. I was reminded of crossing a very, very underutilized border post between Mozambique and Malawi in a vehicle. And I turned up at the post, and for those who have not travelled in this part of the world, I mean, it's described as a border post. Actually, it is a mud hut with a stool, a rickety table, and a big, really dog-eared book, and everything is just done by handwriting. So the idea that, I'm either entering or leaving the country, and anyone in Blantyre or anywhere else is going to know about this for 6 months is a joke. That's not going to happen. But anyway, I turned up and there was no one there, or at least no one visible at the time. So I thought, okay, well, this needs to be done properly. So I opened the book, looked at all the various columns, and I just filled in all the filled everything in myself. Passport details, vehicle details, carnet de passage, and all that kind of thing. And then the guy walked back in and saw me sitting in his desk. So I, immediately took the mickey out of him for deserting his post and said, I'm here. I am. Doing your blinking job for you. Come on, what's this country coming to? And you can imagine how that would have gone down in the UK. If you'd sat behind some administrator's desk. I mean, I would not be here having this conversation now. I'd have been sent off to the gulag. But anyway, this chap broke into a broad grin and roared with laughter. I mean, he thought it was absolutely priceless to see this idiotic white man sitting in his chair, trying to fumble around doing his job. So terrific, and we did it, and that was that across the border. Whereas I remember years ago in Ethiopia, I had to organise a sort of training conference in Addis. And I don't know how it happened, but two of the guys that I took with me from the headquarters, this is when I was in the army, from the headquarters I was working in Kenya, turned up without passports, but they were allowed to fly out. But when we got into the airport at Addis, they said, although, immigration people said, well, where's your passport? I haven't got it. So they were trapped. I couldn't get them on a flight back, but nor were they allowed into the country. Anyway, the reason for mentioning it is that it was like a Monty Python sketch. I went round every single office of the whatever it was, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the but both actually, because they had to, and then the final bit was that having been to about 12 different offices and then constantly being told, no, I need that in triplicate. So they'd give you one piece of paper. I need 2 more copies of that. All right, okay, well, could you just give me 2 more copies, or can you copy? No. But there is a photocopier. If you go out the door here, you take a taxi, you go to, So we had to do all this, got back, finished all the things, and then lo and behold, the last station that I went to get the thing signed off to say that, yeah, they can come into the country was the first bloke I had spoken to. So we could have, all of that stuff, which took me half a day to do, could have been done in the course of 15 minutes. And indeed, if they'd ever bought a photocopier that the public could use. So that,
just think how many jobs that provided, Charles.
Oh, crikey, yeah, and how many after dinner anecdotes for those guys who were giving me the runaround. But even that, there was a perverse pleasure to be taken in being messed around to that degree. I mean, I did find it absolutely hilarious, rather tiring, and it worked. We got them in. Whereas if that had, again, going back to Western Europe, I mean, okay, let's say for the sake of argument it were even possible, but if 2 guys had arrived in this country without passports, and hang on, I might be going in a funny direction here, but to try and to say, oh no, don't worry, I'm running some training for them, it's fine, let them in, and to think that would happen, obviously it's not credible. So yes, I do absolutely agree with you. There is, even where there exists bureaucracy, there is almost always a way to get round it. I'm not suggesting corruption, but to just come to an arrangement that's reasonable. And I think that is deeply refreshing.
But check, yeah. So this was when Carl and I were in China. I'm riding a bicycle there in the middle of Shanghai. Look how few people there are. This is a weekday. If we're going to talk about overpopulation, I'd love to know what it is that people mean when they speak about overpopulation. And I think this is a trope that is constantly used to submit us into a sense of fear.
No, I think it comes back to what I said earlier, and I completely get it. I mean, England does feel overpopulated. England feels overpopulated because of course we're comparing what's the situation today with what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yes.
When you were able to drive from one place to another without having to sit in a traffic queue for 4 hours. And so, my daughter went climbing in South Wales just a few days ago and last weekend. And to get from Plymouth to South Wales should be, 3 hours? It took 7 hours to get there because of the population on the motorways. And so that's when it starts to feel that way.
No, but hold on, Mike. Carl made an interesting point when we were discussing exactly that in Shanghai. He said that it's the management of the people that matters. So in other words, if it takes you that much longer to get between 2 places, is that not because of infrastructural management rather than the number of people?
Yes, because the infrastructure is not built to support the population that inhabits the space that you're in at the moment. The infrastructure that we have in this country was designed 100 years ago, whatever. I don't know when the motorways were built, but 70, 50s, 60s, sometime around then, I guess. Charles, tell me if I'm wrong about that, but that was a different world, frankly, at that time. And certainly Britain would not have felt overpopulated at that stage. But, we have put, how many cars does the average family have now? How many additional families do we have in the country? How many families are not families anymore because they've split up? And so, they're in. So the issue, never mind the immigration issue, the issue of the way that we are living our lives compounds the effect and the feeling that we are in an overpopulated society. It's just about the fact we cannot go about our daily lives in the way that we should be able to because the infrastructure is now, we should not in the UK, for example, be experiencing hosepipe bans in the summer because it rains so much, and that we are on the eastern end of the Atlantic Ocean, of course it rains. And yet we have water shortages. Is it because there's less rain? No, it's because we don't have the water infrastructure and the reservoirs sufficient to support the population that we've decided to have in this country. But that's not an overpopulation issue in and of itself. It is an infrastructure issue at the end of the day.
Because my resistance to the whole overpopulation discussion is, okay, now what?
What
do you mean?
In sense of getting rid of the population? Well, you have a war. You have a war,
so,
Jerm, or you have a pandemic, and you kill people in the hospitals, whatever, or you implement a euthanasia
vaccines.
law. All these things together have an effect, but frankly, the big population bomb that we have at the moment is the demographic of young versus old, and the fact that we're not breeding. We have, and this is not a Western problem either. This is happening right across the world. But humanity, no, it's everywhere. Humanity is not breeding, and so our population problem that we have at the moment is absolutely, if it is a problem, is absolutely temporary. So, but in the meantime, we are absolutely coming up against major pressures in terms of, in the next 20 years, the number of older people that are going to need help and support, the fact that we are not going to have young people there to help and support those older people. And that's where I see even more pressure coming on for legalized killing of old people. That's taken a pretty dark direction, hasn't it? But there you go.
It has taken, or just come to the Kruger Park and climb outside the car when there are lions walking past. But I mean, this overpopulation thing is a very, very multi-layered conversation, because at the beginning, Mike, you pointed out that perception is the important word here, because it is about perception. Because as Charles pointed out, it depends where you go, and you'll find that there are a lot of open spaces with, perhaps there are people, but not that many people, and so what happens is that you end up with a concentration of localization, and that's precisely what we're seeing in cities. Perhaps that's why London is the way it is. But I mean, surely,
yeah. But you're introducing a whole other talking point there, because the concentration in cities, of course, is also something which has been engineered and is an agenda, right? But something Charles can comment more on this. The other issue that of course we face as over the next couple of decades is going to be how we feed ourselves, and that's a large part of the equation here. Is if we have allowed our transport and energy and water infrastructure to collapse, we're also allowing our food production infrastructure to collapse. So that also feeds into the idea of overpopulation. But Charles, what are your thoughts?
Well, we discussed this following Wednesday's news program, because having been put onto it by Mike in the first instance, I reported on actually a quite disturbing piece from the Food Standards Agency, and for the both the United Kingdom and the non-United Kingdom audience, the Food Standards Agency holds the task of regulating how food is produced in order to really how food is sort of meeting the end user, the whoever's going to eat it, to make sure that it's safe. Now, of course, it doesn't take much thinking to consider that what they might mean by safe is not necessarily what you or I might mean by safe. But what's been completely staggering is that in the face of exactly what Mike's describing, you or both of you, the idea that food may become scarce, the answer to the regulator, frankly, who has nothing to do with deciding where food should come from. All they're there to do, or all they should be there to do, is to evaluate what you hold under their noses. And yet the lady running it has taken it upon herself to list in this rather extraordinary document a load of effectively tech solutions for food. So it's all to do with growing or producing fake food. Growing, when I say growing, I mean from cultures. We're talking everything being in a controlled lab-based environment. It's as though she really does not understand what part food plays in life, as in the relationship between the land, the environment, the animal and plant kingdoms, and mankind. She doesn't get it. So that in itself is disturbing. The reason I mention that is because where the conversation went was when there is pressure put on a system, I think in the first instance, that system, or at least the people using it, are forced to make it become more lean, for want of a better word. And the way I see it, and this would be applied the world over, but because of the industrialization of food, the amount of waste and indeed unnecessary inputs and outputs is completely phenomenal. So there's a huge amount of efficiency that could be derived from just changing some of the ways in which food is produced and transported and purchased and everything else. So that's one thing. People wasting less food, which they do waste an enormous amount of, that really is a big one. And then people just making better choices, is the answer. Because again, this going back to this food standards agency document, what was completely absurd is that in the whole of her written piece, the only two foodstuffs that were actually referred to as something that might end up on your plate were chocolate and mashed potato. I mean, we don't need either of those things. You can live life without chocolate and mashed potato, and yet that was sort of her answer. Why? You can just 3D print chocolate and mashed potato, and we're all we're home dry. No, I don't think that's really how it works. So I think again, going on the population and infrastructure thing, it's just exactly like what you quoted Carl as saying. It's just having a system that matches its intended use, and it's if you try and put 20 people on one bicycle, it's probably not going to work. But if your city, and this is what Mike and I saw when we were in Chongqing back in January, February, exactly like your Shanghai photograph of riding a bicycle and thinking, well, where the heck is everybody? It had the same sort of feel. That wider city area has over 30 million people living in it. At no point, except for one very, very touristy place at night, which is always busy because people go there to sort of take photographs and stuff, it didn't feel congested or busy at all. And the UK, from having, with the rose-tinted spectacles on, did have, I believe, an infrastructure that was absolutely appropriate for the population then and the population as it was projected to be. And then it was, I think, post-war, the beginning of the destruction of all of that. And the idea of, and actually I did want to talk about this because I was thinking about it with your fiber cable, but the idea that rather than creating things that are genuinely innovative and new and a good idea, it's just been a constant process of replacement. So what did they do? Decided, okay, well, let's get rid of all the railways because they're really good and they work really well and they're affordable, and let's put the onus back on the individual to go and buy a car to use one of these new motorways. And okay, fine, there may have been a period of time where that worked, but of course, with the way in which population has increased and the continued deterioration and overpricing of the railways, you're then trapped in this. Well, hang on, this is definitely not better than how things were before. And by creating something that you're calling a motorway, this is not a new thing. You're just trying to replace the railway. And it doesn't work in the same way that this, all these digital things, so many of them are just intended to replace a perfectly good analog existing system rather than creating something that adds to what we already have. And I do see that as being at the heart of quite a lot of our problems, just this incessant drive to just, in effect, reinvent the wheel. To what end? It's just pointless. And now you talk to people who are younger, and I remember having this conversation trying to set up, which is why the fiber thing prompts me. I was asking, well, look, I want to have a landline telephone, and I don't want to use a wireless, cordless. And she, she had never even seen a plug-in landline telephone like you'd have had, 20, 30 years ago. So the whole concept to her was one that required her to think in digital terms how you could achieve that and all the various component parts you might have to facilitate this coming off a fiber cable. And I just said, look, seriously, 15 years ago, this was just how it worked.
But Charles, I mean, our cell phones are charging so often that we might as well call them landlines.
Well, there is that, yeah. But I mean, anyway, let's not get dragged down that. Yeah.
You mentioned, Mike, food shortages earlier, and I had two great episodes last week, right? One was Farmer Angus about regenerative farming and foot and mouth disease. But the one that was actually about solutions with Jim Gale gets, as predicted, very little traction. And yet it is such a good talking point. You know, you're growing food in schools, growing food in around prisons, on church grounds. Instead, they have graveyards, which, excuse the pun, are just dead space. What they could be doing is growing food, perhaps in and around prisons. Perfect opportunity. Schools, perfect opportunity. This isn't really being done on any.
Look, you do understand why that is, though. I mean, the reason isn't that because during the Second World War, Dig for Britain, whatever it was called, I can't remember the exact brand name. But anyway, the point was everybody was doing exactly that. Every piece of land was doing exactly that. And as Charles mentioned in a previous program, when we went to Chongqing and we're driving through the countryside outside Chongqing, this was the same thing. Every piece of land is being cultivated that they can possibly cultivate. This is not being encouraged now because for exactly the reason that Charles has just described. The Food Standards Agency, being the regulator for food safety in the UK, is now in the job of promoting the types of lab-grown non-food products which are going to be sold to us in the not-too-distant future. The point is humanity at this point in time is already being farmed. It's being farmed on many, many levels, being farmed digitally for our data. And it's certainly being farmed through the healthcare system because we are just a commodity for the big pharma companies, something that they pump their drugs into and they get paid for. And the same is going to be for the food and all these startup companies supported by the likes of Bill Gates and others that are going to provide these proteins and lab-grown junk. I mean, I suppose in popular culture, if you remember the Matrix, when Neo comes out of the battery bank that he was in and ends up on the whatever the craft was called, I can't remember now. And what was it they were eating? This sort of gloopy slop that was supposedly nutritionally capable of supporting a human body, but actually it couldn't have been described as the food in the sense that we know it. That's the direction we seem to be heading in. And again, it's another profit center for a corporation that is farming humanity. We got to recognize that that's what is actually happening to us and reject that entire way of life.
My discussion with Cynthia Chung kind of overlaps this because she was talking about Malthusianism and the limits to growth narrative. And the point that she was making is that humans have always had the ability to adapt and innovate, and there never needs to be scarcity. And of course, the idea of scarcity is directly linked to the idea of overpopulation and having to reduce families and break apart all these things and not grow food independently. And it just becomes this whole web that just gets pulled down over you because there are so many nodes that you need to try and disconnect. And it becomes very, very confusing for the average person, I think, to figure out which way to look.
I would agree. I think it is terribly confusing, but it is, to be fair, I think it's a very confusing world that we live in. I mean, if you think scarcity, if you say at its simplest level, scarcity is really just a question of being in the wrong place. And to change that at the individual level can be quite challenging. Sorry, what I mean by that is that prior to the decision by people to agglomerate in urban areas, what we might now describe as urban areas, you would follow the food, or you would follow whatever you needed, so that there was idea of scarcity, therefore was in effect self-imposed. If you found that something was scarce, it's because you were just in the wrong place, because that thing wasn't there. You either exhausted it or it had moved or whatever it was, so you followed it. Of course, centuries have passed since that state really has existed for the vast majority of people on Earth now, and it means that our ability to engineer the outcome with regard to scarcity is much more difficult, or the relationship is inverted, because we, by and large, we don't have the ability to go somewhere that there is not a scarcity. I mean, the really good example at the moment is looking at what's happening to the prices at the petrol pumps across certainly Europe.
Up, yeah.
I mean, even I was down in Plymouth Tuesday, Wednesday this week. I saw on my way back on Wednesday night, I saw a petrol price that was what was it, £1.71 per litre. Now, near where I live, just before the current conflict in Iran started, the average price of fuel around here was about £1.27. And that, so sorry, the point is that even between Tuesday and Wednesday, that price has jumped by about another 10 pence a litre. And that is, okay, there is basically price fixing going on, but that is because the conditions of scarcity are being created by not necessarily the actions, the hostile actions of any particular player in that region, but because of, for insurance purposes, vessels carrying oil won't move it. So there's not actually a scarcity of oil, but the conditions make it appear as though there's a scarcity. And what can we do about it? Not much.
Yes.
You see, that's why I'm just going to push back a little bit, Charles, on your comment that the Food Standards Agency lady doesn't get it. I think she does get it, or at least she is part of an overall picture here. If we consider the economic disaster around the COVIDocracy, and then we had immediately hit by the Ukraine situation and the resulting price rises there, and now we're getting this conflict, which was, as everybody knows, was absolutely a matter of choice. That was a decision that was made to do this at this time, and absolutely, I believe, understanding the economic consequences of doing it, we are building not we, but they are creating an economic environment which is going to be ripe for this new food in inverted commas, to be brought to market. We got to look at this in the context of the fact that Bill Gates has been buying up huge quantities of land and so on. All these stars seem to be aligning in a particular direction. Is that a coincidence? I find it very hard to believe that it's a coincidence. I think it's absolutely part of an agenda, and therefore, she herself may not quite understand her role in that agenda, but she is. I think we got to understand that this is being set up for us in a particular way, that we are prepared to accept a particular future which has already been designed.
Mm-hmm.
Someone also said the other day, sorry, Charles, someone said the other day, Mike, that this fuel price hike, they're kicking the can on the road and blaming the war in Iran. But in actual fact, it was always going to come because of the advent of plug-in vehicles and going EV and pushing for the whole sustainable future that the UN is driving. I
don't know the answer to that, but again, it all seems to just slot into place, doesn't it? And so, some people would view that as being a very conspiratorial worldview, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be conspiracy in the sense of a couple of hundred people sitting in a room and saying we're going to do this. But when people's visions for the future align, then inevitably you end up with the same kind of effect, whether it's a formal conspiracy or not. The effect is the same.
But the thing is, just again on that, I think it's very, very absurd to think that Agenda 2030 would now suddenly be forgotten. Obviously, the UN and its aligned organizations and governments are still very much in the game, and they are going to push for all of these goals, no matter what. People have forgotten. I mean, everybody was talking about it during COVID, and now suddenly, what are they just going to now no longer attempt those goals that they were attempting? Obviously,
no. Look, these agendas ebb and flow. That doesn't change.
Yeah.
They're not. Nothing has gone away. They ebb and flow, and things take precedence at this stage. And it doesn't matter whether it takes 5 years or 50 years to get to a point in time. And so whichever is and of course, part of this is just the way it is presented in the public mind by the mainstream media or whomever it happens to be, by politicians and so on. But the agendas themselves don't disappear. They just take precedence for a while and then take a back seat for a little bit, and then they come back with a vengeance. So no, it hasn't gone away.
And I think nor will it, because since it's articulated across 17 goals, all of which have specific criteria attached to them, it's absolutely perfect because it provides the ready answer to, well, why are you doing any of that? Well, it's because we're pursuing, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, according to our policy of whatever. So you can make it all fit. I mean, like when we went back to, we look back to 2020, default answer for any decision, whether idiotic, catastrophic, or worse, was due to COVID. Doesn't matter. Didn't matter what anyone did, how much. Exactly like you say, this was coming down the track. You're shutting down the economy. It's going to be a disaster. People are going to die. Yeah, but I mean, we've got to do it, due to COVID. It was amazing. And it was like it just flicked a switch in people's brains. You just heard the words due to COVID and you just think, right, yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, I'll go along with that then because that makes sense. We have to do it due to COVID. And I would say it's the same. So if you're challenged or anything, well, it's because we're, what are you saying? You're saying we shouldn't pursue the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What do you want? The world to explode? So I think it will always retain that value.
That's why when I bought my car recently, I made sure that it was petrol and not hybrid or battery.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be interesting if Iran was the world's leading producer of lithium? I wonder what would be happening now.
The thing is, though, it creates a strange psychological dichotomy because there's nothing inherently wrong with electric vehicles, or sustainable energy. There's nothing wrong actually with solar panels on your roof. But when you talk about it, you get this resistance because you know what the agenda is, and it makes it difficult then to have a reasonable conversation because it becomes so polarizing.
Yeah, but I would say, I mean, you don't even have to get so far as the agenda. It's just the absolute hypocrisy of writing zero emissions on a vehicle because it doesn't have an exhaust pipe and trying to convince somebody that therefore there's absolutely no ecological or environmental consequence of building that car or the battery that sits in it or the charging processes or all the rest of it. I mean, I totally agree with you. The idea of making an electric car, which let's also point out is well over 100 years old as a concept and as something that's actually been done. So we're definitely not, back to reinventing literally the wheel. But so there's it's just the great con of, yes, we're going to preserve our landscape by putting these ghastly wind turbines in it, rather than just saying, look, actually, if you do make a wind turbine, you can generate a certain amount of electricity at some points during the day. If we do it, everywhere will look horrible and we'll make a complete mess, but we might have a little bit more power at times, which might suit certain communities due to certain factors, rather than trying to pretend that this is in the name of protecting the environment, which is apparently being destroyed by activities that are simply not destroying. I mean, it's just the barefaced stack of lies that accompany it. Because I totally agree. To create, if you are somewhere in the middle of nowhere and you're able to generate power from solar panels and wind or water turbines or whatever it is, well, why wouldn't you do it? Of course you would.
It is incredible. It's exactly the same as COVID again, right? Because, we were told you've got to take this vaccine. It's going to save the world. And of course, there was no full disclosure about anything. So people were told one story about it. It's exactly the same with electric cars or electric anything, because you're told it's environmentally clean, that there's no emissions, that it's going to help deal with the global warming problem. But of course, there's no full disclosure about the lithium mining, the cobalt mining, the actual production process for the turbine itself, the fact that you've got to put a base, a massive concrete base in the ground in order to attach it to, and no discussion of the environmental impact of any of that stuff. No discussion of child labor used in cobalt mines or lithium mines, and all the other rare earths that are required in the generating kit that sits at the top of it. So, without people getting the full picture, no real decision can ever be made about whether this is the right way to be running our lives. People are just so propagandized on everything that there can never be any real proper decisions made about anything. That's why people become sort of non-playing characters, to use that old trope, and they just allow the world to drift past and of course become victims of events.
What's really ironic, though, Mike, is I've noticed people, you're correct when you say people don't have enough information, so they make poorly informed decisions like injecting themselves in the arm or whatever, right? Yet it's inverted because they'll put huge amounts of energy into knowing what's in the next cell phone that they're going to buy. They'll spend days researching the next gadget, but they won't spend 5 minutes thinking about what's being injected into the child's arm.
No, they won't do that, Jerm. They will investigate the features that are provided by that device, but they will not consider. But that's only part of the picture. They won't consider the environmental impact of the production of that device in the first place, and even and I include people that are absolutely leading the charge on the global warming issue. They don't consider these things either. I don't see very many of the big campaigners on these sort of environmental issues that aren't using devices that are environmentally devastating.
You're going to say, Charles?
It's just, disappointingly, there's just been a really sort of apposite example of this, because there's what's being described as an outbreak of meningitis in the southeast of England at the moment. And I heard because it happened, I think, sort of supposed to have first started on a university campus. I think I'm correct in saying. So they've interviewed a couple of the young students to say, so what about it? Because, of course, what have they done? They've offered, they've dusted off the vaccine and offered it to people. And of the two people I heard saying that they'd accepted it, the first said, well, I know that I know antibiotics do a good job, but really, the vaccine is the vaccine's the real deal. That's where it's at. It was basically, she was just susceptible to the marketing. So she said, yeah, so therefore I took it. And the next chap said, yeah, usually I wouldn't, but they were offering this one for free, and normally you have to pay for it. So I took it.
And he'll be paying for it for the rest of his life.
I'm afraid so. Yeah.
No, absolutely, in the NHS system.
But seriously, can you imagine basing, I don't know if his health even the right word, but a health decision on whether or not it costs you sort of £5 or £6. If you genuinely believe, yes, this thing might save my life, but at the moment they're still charging a £5 for it, so I'll probably just leave it.
Yeah. I arrived home the other day and there was a letter sitting waiting for me, and I thought, what the heck's that? So I opened it, and inside was an invitation from my doctor's surgery, which, by the way, I did not register with. Somebody registered on my behalf, but that's neither here nor there. Suggesting that I haven't had a blood pressure check in a very long time, and maybe I should come and have one. I'm sure you can imagine what happened to that piece of paper.
Yeah, and indeed your blood pressure. Yeah. Gosh.
I see we're coming in for the last few minutes, so I want to circle back to the beginning of this chat and just make you feel jealous about my trip. Take a look at that. That is yet another reason why I live on the African continent. Charles, you experienced that, didn't you?
What, a giraffe through the window of a vehicle? Many times. And actually, what I would say is, for anyone who's not really spent any time thinking about giraffes, but wants to see something amazing, and this must exist on YouTube, go onto YouTube and search for giraffes running, because there is nothing quite like watching giraffes drink is incredible. But watching a giraffe run is probably quite difficult on video. But basically, giraffes look like they're running in slow motion. But my goodness, they run quickly. They are extraordinary creatures.
Speaking of extraordinary,
go on.
Well, speaking of extraordinary, this right here.
Sorry, you got your leopard. Yeah. That
is something you almost never see. Even if you go on a game drive. A leopard is incredibly difficult to spot. Haha, made a pun there. Mike, have you been to, I've never asked you, have you ever been to a game park?
I have never been to Africa at all. And that is absolutely a continent I've got to knock off my bucket list, because it is on my bucket list. I think I absolutely would love to visit, but that's such a huge place. Where do you go?
You go to Kruger. I mean, look at this. Right, that was just right next to the vehicle. I mean, that is huge and magnificent. It is just, it's difficult to explain from a photograph until you are right next to it. And
if you're only listening, we're looking at an elephant.
Yes, and that of course, yes, and of course that was the lioness, the mom. She was looking for her cub that went missing, ran in front of our vehicle. But I want to point out that through all of the negativity of what's going on in the world, just for a brief moment in time, I think it is so healthy to get out into nature if you can. Get out. We also had no cell phone signal pretty much for the entire trip. I mean, and it's very difficult when you are used to having connectivity all the time to suddenly not be in that. And then there's a sense of liberation that comes with that. And then you are forced to enjoy the moment, to be present.
Yep.
That is a really good point. And I have to say that was one other aspect of China that was fascinating, because, you know, in the UK, you go into the countryside and quite often the mobile phone signal becomes patchy or worse. In China, there's nowhere you can go where there isn't one. I think there are massive advantages to the African way of doing things. Just don't build that infrastructure in the first place.
Yeah, I'd second that.
Carl made an interesting point. I don't know if it's true, but he said because Tibet is part of China, and if you want to climb, not Kilimanjaro, Everest. He says they've set up cell phone towers now that you can even talk right from the very summit. I don't know if that's true, but I don't think Carl's talking nonsense. All right, Mike Charles, appreciate chatting to you. The internet connection here in the coffee shop has lasted, and hopefully by the time we chat next week, my fiber line will be up and running. But thanks, guys, for joining me in the trend.